Yes, guys, it's one of those days. We're having a smoothie instead of coffee. Don't worry, I'm just as upset about it as you are, I'm sure. Today we're talking about NetherRealm Studios, how they've been mistreating their employees and what the solution is. Because again, it's really easy for a gaming YouTuber to just whine and complain about these things. Most of the videos I've watched today on this very topic are just that. It's just people complaining about stuff. And I thought to myself, maybe I should just follow in their footsteps, make a video where I'm whining and complaining about it. Obviously, they're getting the clicks, so maybe it's worth a shot. But I had to go to my corporate finance class, and we just so happened to be talking about unionization within an artistic industry. In this case, we were talking about the movie industry, with actors and writers and directors being parts of unions. And I thought that they tied together nicely, especially because with regards to NetherRealm Studios and everything that's been happening with gaming employees requesting unionization, it's been a common thread that people have been asking and discussing whether or not unionization within the gaming industry would be a good idea. So that's what we're talking about today. Expect this to get fairly animated down in the comment section below, because this is usually a topic that people either support wholeheartedly or they just don't support it at all. I'm going to try to look at both sides, because usually unions can be a good solution to a very difficult problem, and in that way they should be lauded and we should support them. But to pretend as though there aren't externalities, there aren't other things that need to be considered, is just foolish, because there are some downsides to unions that if you're ignoring them, you're just being ignorant. So I don't want to ignore them, the bad things, and I don't want to ignore the good things. So we're going to look at both and discuss some of the pros and cons of unionization within the gaming industry. Now, first things first, there was a survey that they did back in 2009 where they talked to a vast array of employees within the gaming industry at the time, and they asked them whether or not they would support unionization within the industry that they were working in at the time, being the gaming industry. And what they found was that roughly 34% of said employees supported unionization within their industry. Now, that's actually fairly small, and in general that communicated either a lack of discontent or perhaps a complacency within the industry. Regardless, it wasn't a lot of people. They just did the same survey just a few months ago this year in 2019, and they asked employees at the same companies whether or not they would support unionization. And what they found was that 47% said they would support it and that it was a very good idea. And 26% of employees thought that it was a maybe or possibly a very good idea that they might support. And so we went from about a third of employees saying that they would support unionization to almost 3/4 saying that it was either something they would or would probably support, which in general would show a discontent within the industry and the employees within the industry specifically. And that's something that can't be ignored. So regardless of what solution you offer up, whether or not it's a union, it is something that we should at the very least be able to talk about, because there clearly is an issue. Now, as I said, the common solution is a union, and this is something that's been discussed over the last 20 or so years within the gaming industry. And it's something that's pretty common in artistic industries in general. Like I said earlier, with directors, actors, and writers, they unionized in Los Angeles and in any sort of creative hub like New York. And as a result, their wages increased, their benefits increased, things got better for the writers, but things also got more difficult for the consumers and for the companies that were hiring and firing these people. Because regardless, if you look at it and you say, as a union, we're demanding higher pay, we're demanding better benefits, we're demanding to not work 80-hour work weeks like the employees over at NetherRealm apparently have been forced to work over the last 6 months or so, you require all of these types of things. There are costs associated with it. Obviously, with increasing pay and benefits, there's increased cost with that. But if you look at the gaming industry specifically, where they're being asked to do basically a year's worth of work in a 6-month period, that work still has to get done before the game can launch. So either they're going to lengthen the time in between releases, which increases cost because they're still paying for that labor to be done, it just is taking longer, or you're going to hire contractors and external software engineers and programmers and QA testers to come in and do it as a contracted employee, which again is very expensive. So regardless, the work still has to be done. It just is going to be more expensive, which It should be, companies should not be forcing their employees to work 80 hours or 100 hours. The obvious sort of rebuttal that NetherRealm has been saying is that they never forced anybody to work 80 to 100 hours in a week. But when everybody in the company is doing it, and when it's heavily recommended and it's stated, if you want a promotion, and if you want to stay at the company, and if you want your annual appraisal of your work quality to go well, you should definitely make sure that you work 80 to 100 hours. It's coercion. It's forcing it's forcing employees of the gaming companies to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. So it's not technically mandated within the company, but it's heavily, heavily recommended and heavily pushed on the employees. And this is where one of the largest fallacies of any sort of economic theory or capitalist discussion happens. And it's that a lot of naive individuals who have never been engaged in a management position, who have never studied corporate finance or investment finance or any of the budgetary things that go on behind the doors at these major corporations, one of the things those individuals assume is that there's just a huge pile of money that's sitting in some vault somewhere. And if costs increase because they pay their employees more, that magically that cost is just going to be absorbed by that giant room full of money, that it's going to just be absorbed within the company. They'll give their CEO a pay cut and everything will be fine. This is something a lot of people say with like Walmart. Why doesn't Walmart pay their employees $20 an hour when they're such a major corporation? Well, because there isn't a giant pile of cash laying around. And even if you were to absorb all of the benefits that go to their executives, it wouldn't even pay for a 100th of their employees getting that minimum wage assigned to them. So you have to do the math and you have to consider these things. But in general, when it's boiled down, the effect is just practically the executives are not going to take major pay cuts. They never do. It's just not going to happen. I'm upset about it. You're upset about it. I think they should, but they're just not going to. They never have, and they probably never will. It just doesn't happen. So because that doesn't happen, the cost is going to be pushed off somewhere else. Because again, there's no giant pile of money that they can just go and absorb all these costs into. It has to be absorbed somewhere. So usually where it's going to be absorbed is by the consumer, by the customer, by the person paying for the product, which is why you see when unionization happens, the cost of each and every production increases substantially. Now, there's been a lot of research and studies done on this topic, especially in the acting industry, for instance. So I'm fairly familiar with the acting industry. I do a lot of acting in my spare time outside of YouTube and school and the like. And one thing with acting is that you can be what we would call an equity actor, which is where you're signed with equity, which is an actors union. And if you're signed with equity in Los Angeles, it's great because you go and you get a job on a commercial where you're working 3 days. They have to pay you a set amount for every hour that you're rehearsing your scenes, every hour that you're sitting there not doing anything. They have to pay you for lunch. They have to pay you for travel. They have to pay you for everything. And it makes it so actors working in Los Angeles can make a living doing small commercials here and there. But the second an equity actor goes outside of Los Angeles, for instance, if they come to Denver, and I know this because a dear friend of mine who is an old man now, but he is an equity actor and he's very successful. He was on Star Trek. He actually is an equity actor, and he can't get employed by theater companies for plays and musicals and the like. Here in Colorado because he's an equity actor. Because if they were to sign him, he would have to go through all of those hoops. They'd have to pay him all of that money. So the only way he can get a job here is if he signs an extra contract with the theater company saying that they're going to pay his equity fees, and then equity is going to flip it back to Jonathan, and then Jonathan is going to have to go and pay the theater company all of that money back, so that he's effectively only paid $500 for a 3-month project because it's just a labor of love for him. But they still have to go through all those hoops just to sign an equity actor. So what you usually see is that they're just not engaging. It becomes much more competitive, and they'll start to only look at employees who are not signed with that union instead of going with the unionized actor, because the unionized actor, again, the cost exists. So either they can sign one equity actor and charge $45 a ticket, or they can sign a bunch of non-equity, non-unionized actors and charge $20 a ticket. getting more people in the seats and increasing overall profits. So how does all of this tie into the gaming industry? Well, quite obviously with the gaming industry, it's an artistic space as well. It just looks a little bit different because it's not shorter projects. They're over years and years and years. So what this would effectively look like is if you were to unionize, you would see overall compensation increase, you would see all of these benefits added, everything would improve for the employees. And that's all great, and I support it wholeheartedly. And if ceteris paribus, everything else equal, if that's what it was, I would support it. I would sign the piece of paper right now. I would sign a petition and we would get the ball rolling. I would support it completely. But it's not that, and it never will be that. There are a lot of externalities and external considerations that we need to take into account. So beyond all of those benefits, what we would also see is that it would become incredibly competitive to get into one of these gaming studios, because when they have the cost increase per employee, they're going to be much pickier with which employees they choose. Furthermore, for indie studios, which not a lot of people talk about when they're discussing a union within the gaming industry, you would see indie developers likely not even hiring unionized artists or unionized developers and programmers because of the increased cost. So again, people would get out of college if they signed on with the union immediately, or if they waited to sign on until they got with the company, you would see overall competition increase. And if you didn't want to work at one of the big guys like EA or Ubisoft, you would likely not even join the union because the smaller company would just not be interested. In the same way that a Denver theater company is not interested in an equity actor because of the increased cost. This is part of the reason that a lot of the time in these industries, when a union is created, you'll start to see unions mandating each and every employee sign on with said union so that the employer can't go and look for employees who are outside of the union who are going to cost less while still doing good work. So it's one of those things where either everybody's on board or no one is, because once that first domino falls, the entire thing collapses because they can start to push out the unionized members and just bring in non-unionized members. And we're right back where we started, except a bunch of people are now unemployed because they happen to join the union. At the same time, we also have to consider the fact that if a company like NetherRealm had all of their employees walk out, as they have, and demand that they unionize or demand higher pay, a company like NetherRealm in the video game industry likely needs quick turnaround. They need to get working on the next project and DLC and updates and patches and those types of things. So they're much more likely to just absorb the hit and start to pay them more and try to just deal with it. But a larger company like EA, who has thousands of employees and can pass the workload around and is not afraid to delay a bunch of projects and those types of things, what you could see is them just saying, okay, you don't like it, walk out. We'll just hire some newbies from right out of college and we'll pay them a little bit more than we're paying you right now, kind of to flip the birdie at you. And you're just going to be out of work for trying to unionize against us. So we dare you to do it. And that's what happens in a lot of other industries. Like retail, it's a common thing. If you threaten to unionize, you're immediately fired and they just find somebody else. When I worked at Best Buy, it was a common thing where employees were very unhappy, felt as though they were being abused, felt as though they were taken advantage of. But if you even muttered the word union, if you even started thinking about it, you were gone. And again, I just want to stress, it's often that when we hear a company is adverse to a union, we think big, bad, greedy capitalist is being evil again, but there are costs associated with it. And if we're going to have a reasonable conversation about whether or not it's a good idea, we need to be able to discuss those things. And the second that you shut down the conversation by saying, well, mean, greedy capitalist doesn't want this, we can't have the conversation, everything's terrible. But if we can sit down and have that conversation, if we can point out the pros and cons, we can actually reach a solution. All of this to say, the cost has to be absorbed somewhere. And where I think you would see this cost absorbed, if the industry were to unionize, and at least most of the large companies and developers were to unionize, what you would see is you would see longer time in between releases. You'd also see much smaller projects, so you wouldn't see as many huge new IPs. They would rely and rest on their laurels, because if Call of Duty is making the money, they're going to keep making Call of Duties. And these larger projects are just not worth the risk because the cost is so much higher now. What you'll also see is that you could see the starting average price of a game jump from $60 per unit all the way up to $70 to $80. Again, the cost has to be absorbed somewhere. You'll also see season passes become much more likely and much more common, and you'll also see a lot more microtransactions coming back into the fold. The reason that we've seen a decline in microtransactions crammed in is partially because of a lot of the uproar that we've seen after such a thing as Battlefront 2 and that whole debacle. But more than anything, it's partially because with the advent of these digital distribution services that EA has, for instance, with Origin, or Uplay with Ubisoft, or BethesdaNet with Bethesda, what we've seen is an increase in overall profit margin. So they get a larger cut. This is why I initially, on the outset, support Epic in what they're doing, because Steam taking 30% of every sale versus the 12% Epic wants to take, that's effectively an 18% increase in profit. That is a huge deal. And so, of course, these companies are going to be looking at Epic, and that competition hopefully will drive that margin up, and so they can start making more money from each and every sale that they make. Steam is yet to roll over on that. I don't know why. It's almost like Steam is greedy. Who would have thunk? And so, a definitive answer from me, because I feel like you're entitled to it at this point after sitting through all of this. I think a union could be a very, very good thing with the industry. I would not mandate that everybody right outside of college signs up with the union, because that's going to make it very difficult for indie studios to continue to exist. And indie studios are incredibly important in the modern gaming marketplace. I think most people would agree with that. So as long as it's a complete and utter choice within each and every single individual as to whether or not joining is the right thing for them, in that case, I would support it. But I would not mandate that everybody within the gaming industry who's a developer sign on with it. Secondly, I fully understand and expect that there will be costs that I will have to absorb in order to improve the quality of life and improve the working conditions of the employees at these studios. I'm willing to do that. Based on the polls I've taken of a lot of my viewers who I think are really level-headed and I think are smart. Maybe I'm biased, I don't know. But based on the polls I've conducted with you guys, a lot of you guys are either unwilling or incapable of absorbing those same costs. So an increased price in the starting listing price of a game from $60 to $70 for the launch would increase lower initial sales and would increase the likelihood of consumers to wait to purchase the game for several months until the price goes down even further, which some people are already doing even with the $60 price tag. So having taken all of these things into consideration, I will say I do support unionization within the industry with those caveats I lined out, and with the full expectation that costs are going to increase, because I think it's important we talk about all of the benefits and the negatives and the detracting elements as well. Otherwise, we're just being idiots who are circle jerking each other, pretending to be pro-employee, pretending to be supportive of artists when we haven't actually thought it through. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, though. Anything you have to say, leave it down below in the comment. I will be reading through as many of them as I possibly can. Thank you guys so much for watching. Next video is going to be critique on Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Make sure to join on Patreon or the channel join button that you'll see right below this video to get access to that critique for a full week before anybody and everybody else gets access to it. It's my way of saying thank you to you. Everybody still gets to see it. It just, you get to see it early. But that's all for me. Thank you for watching. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.